Okay, so this lecture is just a overview of the class. And the main thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of content that we leverage from 3260 that directly integrates to the type of analysis we did in this class. So everything is, of course, based off of differential equations, and that was the main basis. So we spent a lot of time figuring out how to write differential equations for various types of systems. So for instance, moving from electricism and magnetism physics, which is one of the main components of midterm one, we then were able to describe equations of motion for moving coil transducers or moving oil iron transducers, also called solenoids, that we had a midterm one problem on, and also motors and generators, right? So from there, we were able to come up with equations of motion. In certain cases, especially when we talked about electrical systems, we had nonlinear equations of motion that would come from here, and then we would step through linearization to get then system dynamics for the system. So a lot of the principles that we use in this class are based off of linear system theory. And so then the nonlinear systems that we have coming directly from the physics of these types of machines are not amenable to using these types of tools, at least the tools that we're using in this class. And so we'd have to do linearization. We had a problem on midterm 2 in this, and also there's a cases of linearization that was done in homework and review sheets, and also the project had a slightly easier linearization problem that we had to deal with there. But that was a major step. This is oftentimes multivariable linearization, um, which was a little bit more complicated. Also, we looked at how differential equations can be used to model fluid power systems. We went through some examples with motors and pumps and the dynamics related to these, and also the different elements that could be in a fluid power system, such as accumulators, valves, inertances, etc., to get system dynamics. Again, starting with differential equations, and then we were using directly some of the mathematical tools used in 3260, like the Laplace transform, to give us a frequency domain representation, which then can also be directly applied to come up with transfer functions, right? And so the main emphasis of this class is not necessarily this pathway, which was more of an emphasis in 3260, going from differential equations to frequency domain representations, then solutions to differential equations. We more often than not looked at transfer functions, which are input-output relationships, and how we can then use these transfer functions for a variety of different analyses of dynamic systems. So this was the main thing that we focused on in terms of math representations of our systems in this class. We can extend this idea to interconnections of transfer functions, or what's also called block diagrams or frequency responses in Bode plots. And these, what I say, would all be the background knowledge that we used in this class. Also, a specific tool which helped us understand what is the long time solution to our differential equations called the final value theorem. And this is a very convenient way for us to understand steady state behaviors, where that would be fairly difficult to do that if we went through the pathway of taking differential equations, taking frequency domain representations, then finding the solution. This is a really easy way to get to that answer. Okay, so finishing up midterm one, we then oftentimes use the transfer function to understand system dynamics. Once we have this linear form, or if it started out linear, we can then describe transfer functions for these types of systems, and likewise, we could use the transfer function here as well. This is often what a lot of our problems look like. So once we have this description of either our electromechanical machines or our fluid power machines, from here we can start to look at systems integration, where we're trying to integrate these individual elements along with if they're part of a mechanical system as well. So say, for instance, rotating disk, moving masses, etc., that we can then start to understand how can we control this, this system. And we called either these fluid power systems or these types of electromechanical machines, we call these the plant. So these would be, or sorry, these would be elements of the plant. And in this, we say, all right, we want to now control the output of the plant. All right, we want the plant, whether that be a motor system connected to mechanical linkages or some sort of fluid power system driving some sort of element, we want to control the output, and that could be either position, that could be velocity, that could be a variety of different things. For thermal systems, that'd be temperature. It's really in the context of what you're attempting to do. We wanted to start looking at these principles of control, which now we're talking about integrating multiple systems. So going back, once we have descriptions of the plant, we can then start to interconnect these, and in particular, interconnect these with controllers. We talked about a specific type of controller, such as PID control. Um, and another mode in which we can control these is by looking at lead lag control, right, which is a different type of controller, but it's the same thing. It's the idea that we have a differential equation that modifies the open loop response, therefore it modifies the closed loop response, and then the majority of the last 5 to 6 weeks of this class is trying to understand that now once we have this plant in a loop with also a controller, how do we understand the behavior of this system? So we spent a lot of time looking at um, elements of feedback. What's a feedback control loop? We can describe system type. We can also describe the system's response to a second order system. And so this we specifically looked at second order under damped systems, but we said that, okay, most systems are more complicated than this, but we can use this kind of prototypical response of a second order under damped system to try and understand more complicated systems. So even though it's not exactly second order under damped, it could have extra poles, it could have extra zeros. Most systems behave approximately like a second order under damped system. How do we draw analogies between the rows? Really convenient way to look at all the possible closed loop pole locations as we vary a single parameter. So this helped us understand how a single gain in the system can affect the closed loop response. So we use this root locus to either design the gain or understand based off our knowledge of second order undamped systems, or sometimes we were understanding, is the system stable, and understanding what happens to stability as we increase the gain or decrease the gain. And so that was a majority or major focus of the last few weeks of this class, is these root locus methods. So we could use this for stability analysis. We could use this through control design. For control design, this means that we're taking these type of forms for the lead and lag controller, say for instance just a single real zero, a single real pole, and then we can understand via the root locus methods how this control design is basically understand how to design these controllers. And I know they're not arrows going here, but they're always then feeding this back and trying to say, once we have this design, what can we say about the system in terms of a second order under damped response? And that means knowing the closed loop pole locations, knowing the system type, what can we make in terms of statements of how we expect the system to behave. And so that's kind of a synopsis of the class. I guess the main elements of the class. At the very end, we got into these ideas of how we can use frequency domain methods to understand the Nyquist plot. And from here, we could understand the gain margin and the phase margin. So we were just barely able to touch this subject before we had to adjourn for the class. But these were factors of safety for our systems that just like you have factors of safety for a bracket if you're doing a failure analysis, you have that with control systems as well. So how much uncertainty can we handle in the gain of the plant, the phase of the plant before we see uncertainty in the system. The last thing I want to mention is that we looked at a lot of software tools in the form of mostly in the project. So we had a few homework problems that use software tools, but mostly the projects are what leverage this. These are, of course, outside the scope of the final exam, but this is a pretty major part of what we did in this class as well, in terms of understanding software tools in this class and how we can use this, namely MATLAB's CISO tool, which is part of the control system toolbox, and also simulating packages. So that kind of wraps up the class. This outer box gives you an idea of what is potentially contained in the comprehensive final here. And just like I've been saying in class, the final is going to be comprehensive, but it's going to have an emphasis on the material that we learned since midterm 2. So anything that's not in this blue, green, or kind of purplish box here is going to be what's going to be the emphasis for the final.